countries such as India, which are very early on in their development stages, which have been low historical contributors to climate change, and which even now, even with their total emissions at 3.5 gigatons, are still very low per capita emitters, that our development needs and objectives cannot be subordinated to climate mitigation needs. The two have to go hand in hand. We cannot ignore climate change because it is a real and immediate danger and the impacts are being felt now, but one cannot come at the cost of the other. So how can we think about climate policy in a way that recognizes the potential trade-offs wherever there might be between climate action and development priorities, and that tries to leverage wherever there might be areas of co-benefits between the two.
Climate change isn't just an environmental crisis. It's a multiplier of risks, threatening to undo decades of hard-won economic progress, destabilize livelihoods, and deepen inequalities. For a country like India, where development needs remain urgent, the question isn't whether to act on climate change, but how to act in a way that prioritizes both people and the planet. How do we design policies that turn climate challenges into opportunities for equitable growth? What's the theory of change for a nation balancing rising emissions with rising aspirations? And where are the low hanging fruits, the actionable strategies that deliver co benefits for development and decarbonization? To unpack this, we are joined by Aman Srivastava and Easwaran Narassimhan from the Climate Policy Division at the Sustainable Futures Collaborative, a Delhi-based think tank known for its rigorous academic approach and commitment to policy-relevant research. They'll break down India's unique crossroads, outlining the four critical policy levers for a climate-ready development model.
Thank you so much, Aman and Easwaran, for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you, Anirudh, for having us.
Thank you, Anirudh. Pleased to be here.
Aman, can we begin this conversation by first understanding what SFC does, your work areas, and then maybe, if after that brief introduction, you could set the context for the conversation in which maybe you could highlight what really does development-centric, climate-ready approach mean?
Sure, I'll take a try at doing that. So let me start with a quick introduction of SFC, the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. We're a relatively young think tank with a mix of young and old people. We were set up about a year and a half ago as a Section 8 company based in New Delhi, and we're about 20 odd people right now. What we try and so we primarily work on four areas which are all kind of interconnected among themselves. These four are adaptation and resilience, which is particularly important in the context of a climate vulnerable country such as India. Climate mitigation policy, which is the area that Easwaran and I jointly work on. Energy transitions, which are critical to any sort of low carbon development policies, and environmental governance and policy, wherein environmental governance largely also pertains to air quality, which is often seen as a cousin of climate, but they're very closely interlinked in terms of reinforcing each other's harmful impacts. So these are the four areas that we work on, and I think what we try and do that sets us apart is we try and take a very rigorous academic approach to doing the research that we do, while also ensuring that it is policy relevant. And we try and focus on some of the upstream framing questions, which are less about implementation and the what's and so on, but more about the hows and about whether we're even asking the right questions. So I think that's kind of my quick introduction to SFC, and I'm, Easwaran, feel free to jump in and supplement me with any information I may have missed. To your second question, which was more on development-centric, climate-ready approaches. So this is something that we have tried to internalize within the work that Easwaran and I and our team do on climate policy. And I think it comes from a recognition that countries such as India, which are very early on in their development stages, which have been low historical contributors to climate change, and which even now, even with their total emissions at 3.5 gigatons, are still very low per capita emitters, that our development needs and objectives cannot be subordinated to climate mitigation needs. The two have to go hand in hand. We cannot ignore climate change because it is a real and immediate danger and the impacts are being felt now. But one cannot come at the cost of the other. And so what we try and do with our work is we try and look at the intersection of these two. So how can we think about climate policy in a way that is that recognizes our development needs, that recognizes the potential trade-offs wherever there might be between climate action and development priorities, and that tries to leverage wherever there might be areas of co-benefits between the two. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, but let me pause there and maybe ask Easwaran to come in with more, because he has a lot to say on this as well, of course.
Oh, thanks, Aman. I just wanted to quickly add that we also look at it from the viewpoint of climate action as an economic opportunity for an emerging economy like India to develop and reap economic benefits such as job creation and enhanced GDP and higher income levels as we undertake climate action.
It's very interesting, to put things in perspective, like climate change is not only being looked as something to which we need to react, but also as an opportunity to be able to accelerate our development efforts. But looking at this development-centric, climate-ready approach, there are also some other concepts such as low-carbon development pathways, which we also known as decarbonization approaches, or other approaches which are out there. Would you want to take a moment and maybe distinguish those approaches with the approach that you have taken?
Low carbon approaches or like decarbonization approaches are often very mitigation centric and focus on emission reductions as the primary objective. And what distinguishes low carbon approaches or decarbonization pathways from low carbon development pathway, or what others call as climate positive development in the social sciences literature, primarily focuses on climate action as an economic opportunity and keeps development at the center of any policy decision, but any development that you undertake is a net climate positive. And that's the approach that climate positive development and low carbon development pathways focus on. And this is significantly different from the erstwhile low carbon growth, green growth, and decarbonization pathways, all of which focused primarily on mitigating carbon emissions.
If I may jump in a little bit over here, Anirudh, I think that's a good question that you ask, because there are so many terms floating around nowadays. I mean, we hear low carbon, we hear net zero, we hear decarbonize, we hear climate compatible, and to a large extent, all of these terms are complementary, overlapping, even mean the same thing, but there are maybe minute differences between each of them. So net zero, for example, of course, has a very clear timeline in mind and is very, very emission-centric. Climate compatible development probably prioritizes development a little bit more than climate does. Things like that. One of the recent terms which I think we've been thinking about is this term called carbon positive development, which at first thought sounds very much like low carbon development. But I think there's also, the term carbon positive is also meant to mean going beyond net zero. So being beyond carbon neutral. And when we think about carbon positive development, one of the other questions that comes up, which SFC doesn't work on too much right now, is the issue of carbon dioxide removals, which becomes an important question when we look at the state of emissions right now and the fact that for most countries mitigation actions aren't keeping pace with the needs. And there's a lot of talk around how carbon dioxide removal, which is a set of technologies that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, could also have development linkages in terms of improving soil productivity, agricultural output, livelihoods, and so on. So I do want to distinguish between terms such as low carbon development and climate compatible development on the one hand, and carbon positive development, which may potentially have a slightly different interpretation.
I think the interpretation also quite varies based on the scholar who is using these terms, right? So it's been interpreted very differently in different contexts. For example, social sciences literature interprets climate positive development in a very different way compared to the technical climate science literature that talks about carbon positive, carbon negative, climate positive, carbon neutral, net zero. All of these have very nuanced variations in the technical literature. But if you for example, focus on the social sciences and the policy interpretation, climate positive development is used to frame this idea of climate change as an economic opportunity, particularly in the global south where there is plenty of renewable energy resources, labor cost is very low, and a lot of the physical infrastructure needs to be built, right? So, and the combination of this then provides room for economic growth that can be a net climate positive. And that's the angle from which a lot of the scholars are looking at climate positive development. And in addition to that, this opportunity framing is much more palatable for politicians and policymakers in emerging economies than the regulatory framing that has been pushed from the global north for a very long time, focusing much more on carbon dioxide emissions. So, if I were to just give like a couple of examples, Aman provided the example of CDRs, right? So, engaging in agroforestry and developing that industry is one example of climate positive development that will create net, significant net new employment, in addition to also being synergistic in building a climate resilient society that also keeps carbon under the soil. So developing sectors like this can be looked at from the lens of climate positive development.
No, thank you so much. And I think with this, in all of this jargon, the idea which we are picking up today is that of leveraging co-benefits with respect to development and not releasing as much carbon in the air and maybe as carbon positive as you're talking about. But with this theory of change in our mind, what would be our key priority areas on which we should look at? So as to if we want to achieve this idea in our mind, which is of generating co-benefits, what should be the policy areas we should be focusing on? Would you want to highlight some of those areas on which you've been working on?
Do you want to take this, Easwaran, or?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so again, maybe I'll just take the first stab and then invite Easwaran to step in to supplement any gaps that I may have left. So when we kind of set up SFC about a year and a half ago, we did a lot of brainstorming about what exactly we wanted to focus on, because as a small team of about 20 odd people as we are, there are only so many things we can do well. And specifically in the area of climate, I think we decided to take a little bit of a multi-pronged approach and focus on 4 key areas that would be complementary and mutually reinforcing. The first was on how we even think about what are the combinations of what is possible in the future, what sectors could look like, what combinations of policies could work well in tandem with each other, and so on. And that kind of ended up becoming a little bit of a lens through which we look at modeling. So a lot of our explorations of future scenarios and projections come from these things called emissions economy models, and there are many of them out there that are operated by various think tanks and consultancies and universities and so on. The challenge there is that, well, there's multiple challenges with them, but I think because there's so many different models, there's obviously going to be so many different scenarios and so many different results. What we aim to do with the first prong of our work is to try and improve how we look at these models, build modeling capacities, understand how to use them, understand how to interpret them, understand what not to take too seriously because of the limitations that they come with. And do this in close quarters with the government, enable the state to imagine these sorts of long-term low-carbon development pathways, and encourage that sort of long-term strategic thinking. So that's one. The second is, okay, the government has thought about all of this. How do we build capacity within the government to actually act on this? And maybe I'll give one example.
Yeah.
India doesn't have a climate law right now, but it has lots of laws that are pertinent to the climate, whether it's on forestry or energy or water resources and so on. Each of these laws falls under the domain of a different ministry. How do you ensure that sort of coordination? So this points towards the need for various questions, right? One is, do we need something more overarching? Do we need better mechanisms for coordination? What sort of institutional capacity do we have to develop? So the second strand of our work is focused on, the recognition that we need institutions with some sort of teeth to forge that sort of coordination, to be able to think upon and design and implement these sorts of policies that we might need in a way that is inclusive and recognizes the appropriate stakeholder consultations that we need to have in place. So that's number 2. 3 is then thinking about what might be needed for each sector. So, and in this, I think we recognize that any sort of economic transformation, any sort of low carbon development at the sector level, whether we're looking at industry or steel, aluminium, etc., it doesn't require just the operation of free markets, but it also requires some sort of active state steering to direct them towards where they need to go. And this becomes the third strand of our work, which is focused on something called green industrial policy. And the last is looking at finance, which we see as an enabler, because any sort of transformation, any change requires money. And not just amounts of money, but thinking about how much is needed, where it comes from, where it's supposed to go, what type of money it should be, whether it should be equity, which might be kind of more risky, whether it should be debt, which might risk creating indebtedness. What is the role of the state in providing that sort of the finance? What is the sequencing and temporality of that money? Do we need it now? Do we need it 5 or 10 years from now? And so on. So these are the 4 strands of work where we're looking at thinking about long-term pathways and combinations of policies, what capacities we have to build within the state to help plan and design those policies, what the state can then do in terms of green industrial policy packages, and what sort of financial support might help realize some of these policies. Easwaran, anything else to add on that?
I mean, you summarized it really well, Aman. I thought I could, take an example and go through these 4 areas, just to make it interesting to the listeners. So if you were to, take the 4 pies we have in the circle that we work on, we're starting with modeling and then thinking about the institutions required to then enact policies that would then allow us to make these possible low carbon development pathways a reality, and then what sort of industrial policy approaches are needed for us to get economic co-benefits from climate action, and then how much money is needed to successfully benefit from the energy transition, right? So if I were to take one example, for example, if I were to take the transport sector, right? So a bunch of models today inform policymakers on where India's emissions should peak, by what date, and then how it can align to India's 2070 net zero goal, and slowly ramp down its emissions over time to reach net zero. And within this, you have different sectors: industry, transport, electricity, agriculture and land use, etc. Right. So if you were to take the transport sector, a lot of the models converge on a couple of technology options. Electrification of public transportation, electrification of private transportation, and some hydrogen-based freight transportation to then effectively decarbonize the transport sector over time. But the modeling studies differ in terms of when you would start decarbonizing transport sector, how rapidly would you like to penetrate the electric vehicle deployment in the country, and by what date you would want to achieve a full electrification of the transport system. And models also differ in how important mode shifting from private transportation to public transportation needs to be, right? So in the modeling work, what we have been doing is to look at all the modeling studies, and then think about what input assumptions they are coming with, what's the data that they are using, where the technology and policy choices are converging, and where they are diverging. Right, and this is one exercise that we've been doing. And if we look at the transport sector, given these variations, then you'd want to think about how to now execute and design and implement policies. So one thing that we've been arguing is that we should focus on where all of these studies are converging and agreeing upon, right? And then how do you go about doing that? Second, coming to the institutions, like Aman mentioned, there is no climate law. If you want to look at transportation and physical infrastructure, you have the Ministry of Heavy Industry on one side working on propping up manufacturing, then you have the Ministry of Commerce, and then you have the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, and all of these have to coordinate in order to ensure that the transport sector policies are implemented successfully. Right, and right now you don't have a legal mechanism that forges this sort of horizontal coordination at the central government level, and you can't just forge horizontal coordination and think that it will become successful. You also need vertical coordination between the central government and the state level bureaucracies, because a lot of the physical infrastructure that's going to be built are going to be built in the states, and like electricity is both a central and state subject. Even in the transport sector, there is a lot of decision making that happens at the state level. So then you would want climate institution, an overarching climate legislation that would mainstream such a coordination to occur on a regular basis and consume information coming from these modeling reports and insights from think tanks to then effectively implement policies, right? So one model may say that India could become 100% electric vehicles by 2030. Another model would say, no, that's unrealistic. India would probably start selling all EVs by 2045, right? Then how do you then reconcile these two and then think about what is the realistic possibility frontier, not the theoretical possibility frontier? And then the third aspect is, during this coordination process, mainstreaming co-benefits, thinking of climate action as an economic opportunity becomes crucial, and that's where green industrial policies come into picture, right? How fast do you want to penetrate electric vehicles, given that India still depends on majority of electric vehicle components imported from China and other countries like Korea and Japan. If India is interested in reaping, higher value economic rents from this huge large scale transformation in the transport sector, then should it actually go slow and think about incentivizing EV manufacturing and climbing up the electric vehicle value chain, investing heavily in R&D, and then very carefully sequence large scale deployment over time, rather than start with large scale deployment now and then feel like we have lost the bus, like we did with solar manufacturing back in the past, right? So that's where the industrial policy approach comes into picture. There is no right decision here. What matters is what is the national goal, and whether a particular approach is going to help us achieve that national goal, which comprises of a set of objectives, both economic and environmental. And finally, all of this requires finance. And the crucial part coming to the transport sector decarbonization is that most of India's fossil fuel tax revenues go into welfare spending, both at the state level and central government level. Some states are dependent on fossil fuel tax revenues for close to 20% of their state budget. Some states at 6% or 7%. At the central government level is at about 10 to 12%. And some of it is coal tax, and a lot of it is gasoline, diesel and petroleum taxation. In a decarbonizing situation, if we were to electrify the transport sector, the fossil fuel consumption is going to go down to zero eventually, and the revenues are going to dry up. And that's going to have severe distributive consequences on people who depend on welfare spending. Then how do you then think about this transport sector transition? Do you think about this transport sector transition only from the perspective of purely electrifying vehicle transportation, cleaning up the grid to make sure that the electricity that the electric vehicle receives is clean energy, and then think that we have solved it? Or do we think about state budget constraints that would likely emerge, central budget constraints that would likely emerge as fossil fuel revenues dry up? So these are critical questions on the finance side that we'll have to think about as we think about policies for cleaning up the transport sector, right? So this is how we would like to think about the four sub areas of work that we do within the climate policy vertical.
Thank you so much, Aman and Easwaran. I think this calls for a systemic review with respect to how we as such are not only approaching our development needs, but also our climate goals. But having said that, what would you consider as the most critical lever while we are trying to enter into this area of policy making where we can generate co-benefits with development? Because I'm assuming that such a systemic change as such right now, wherein it's working as a well-lubricated machine, is not going to happen anytime soon when it comes to generating co-benefits. What would be the most critical lever that you both look at so that we can bring more synergies with respect to policy making in this area?
Do you want to take this one, Easwaran, or?
You can go ahead if you want.
Yeah, it's well, Anirudh, you're asking some really tough questions here, right? Because when you're saying that some of these things are not going to happen in the immediate future, but what is one of the critical levers? The question that I'm hearing is a little bit similar to the very overused term low-hanging fruits. What are the low-hanging fruits we can pluck at right now? And I think there's a lot of it also comes down to what Easwaran said about green industrial policy, right? So let's step aside from climate for a second and look at development. India is still adding about 6 to 8 million people to its employable workforce every year. People need employment, especially when we're in a situation where the economy is not growing as fast as it could potentially. As incomes are increasing, we are seeing more consumption, whether it's the purchase of properties, purchase of cars, purchase of all sorts of goods that then increase demand in turn for industrial products such as steel and aluminium and so on. So within a situation where we are kind of expecting that our transport sector will continue to grow significantly, our steel sector will grow, cement will grow, aluminium will grow, etc., etc. And we want to try and do this while exploiting some of the climate benefits that come along with it, and while reaping the gains of economic competitiveness. Because the other thing that's happening is none of this happens in isolation. We are looking at a world that is beginning to deglobalize, and it started a couple of years ago with the US passing its Inflation Reduction Act, the European Union passing its Green Deal industrial policy. It's obviously being accelerated by the election of Donald Trump and so on. So it becomes, and with the increase of geopolitical rivalries, it becomes more and more important for us to think about what we've labeled as Atmanirbharta, the domestic manufacturing capabilities. Doing that can yield these multiple benefits in terms of putting us on a lower carbon development pathway, increasing employment, because manufacturing is more labor intensive than services, which is the current driver of growth right now, and it can help us with our trade and competitiveness. So then when we're talking about decarbonizing industry as an example, then you're talking about a couple of different things. Industry uses energy and it has various processes. You want to decarbonize energy, and that is one area of low-hanging fruit. Energy is responsible for 70% of our emissions. We're already in the process of boosting our solar capacity. There's an open question, as Easwaran said, about how much of that is happening in-house versus how much is being procured from other countries such as China, but we are increasing our solar capacity. Can we do that in a way that is more kind of domestically produced and boosts employment, while also recognizing that just the buildup of solar capacity is not sufficient? We also need to think about storage capacity and strengthening the grid to be able to receive that generation and so on. So that becomes one very, very tangible and well-recognized area where we can reach some of these multiple development and climate objectives. The second then becomes more on the side of processes, and that's where kind of Easwaran can speak a lot more about industrial policy in some of these sectors that we're looking at. But yeah, I'll pause there and hand back to Easwaran.
Thank you, Aman. I mean, the immediate action that in the short term, right? So there are a lot of long-term actions that can be taken, and you're totally right that setting up climate institutions, building capacity for strategic thinking and industrial policy implementation, and identifying instruments for better flows of climate finance is all very challenging, and a lot of it is going to take time. But India has, in fact, done some of these really well, rather in a very ad hoc way, but has seen success in the past, right? I'll just briefly give the example that everyone gives, which is the National Solar Mission under the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which was implemented in 2008, right before Copenhagen Climate Summit. The National Solar Mission has been a big success. If you look at multiple objectives of both job creation, local manufacturing, and solar deployment, it may not look like a big success. But then if you look simply at climate action and clean energy deployment, the National Solar Mission is in fact a huge success. India has close to 150 gigawatts of renewables with more than 100 gigawatts of solar, and rapidly scaling up rooftop and decentralized solar as well, with Prime Minister's recent policy announcement on national level subsidies for rooftop solar. And if you look at some of the clever policy instruments that bureaucrats implemented to make National Solar Mission a success, was starting with blending solar with coal, right? So solar was very expensive in the initial years back in 2010 to 14 or 15, and they used to blend coal with solar, thereby making the price very attractive for the state level utilities to absorb power evacuated from solar projects. And as the technology costs went down significantly thanks to China's industrial overcapacity in solar and the Western countries implementing anti-dumping duties on Chinese solar panels, it was quite strategic for India to make use of that situation and move to a competitive bidding process. Even then, there was a big gap in the pricing that was acceptable for the state level utilities compared to the pricing at which solar project developers could develop the project. And then the government came up with another policy called the viability gap funding, where they bridged this viability gap, thereby pushing solar deployment further. And they came up with other, very creative policies like plug-and-play solar parks, because getting permissions from various departments was the biggest challenge for a lot of developers. And if the government were to do that, identify sites and create these plug-and-play solar parks, then the price went down even further. And finally, in addition to all of this, India also had the non-banking financial institutions like IREDA, which was a project financing arm to promote solar deployment and help project developers with the project financing stage, as renewables were considered as projects with high risk premium in those days, right? So these are some of the successful examples that India has implemented in the past and could continue to do that with very mature technologies like solar and wind and offshore wind as it also emerges and gets commercialized successfully. There are technologies like green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, battery storage technologies, and some very high technology electric vehicle technologies that are just emerging, and the country needs time to catch up on those. In terms of purely climate action, focusing on energy efficiency standards, right? Vehicle fuel economy standards, industrial energy efficiency standards are all low-hanging fruit that the country could very easily focus on and see success, and flatten the emissions curve that is required to achieve a certain level of income and economic growth before we successfully start to decouple emissions from economic growth itself.
If I may quickly add, we even in looking at these low-hanging fruits, we need to be very careful of the trade-offs though, because as Easwaran mentioned, one of the things we're seeing is the emergence of battery technologies, which is starting to pick up pace, and we're seeing the rollout of EVs in India. And we're seeing a proliferation of domestically manufactured EVs, especially by the Tatas and Mahindras, which was enabled by historical industrial policy, which levied customs duties on imported vehicles and created an ecosystem where companies like the Tatas and Mahindras were able to innovate and come up to par. And now their EVs are as good as any others. And the Mahindras just rolled out a couple of models a few days ago, which saw unprecedented demand, which is great from a consumer point of view. It is great from a supply point of view, because you're generating employment, you're creating domestic industry and so on. It is not necessarily helpful from a demand point of view, right? Because when you're selling a 20 lakh EV, that's doing nothing for transport access for 95% of our population. So even when you're thinking about these low-hanging fruits for climate, it should not come at the expense of ignoring other things such as public transport systems, which may not be as immediate. They may have longer timelines of 5 or 10 years. but they are absolutely essential, whether they are seen as low-hanging or not. So policymakers have to find that balance between what might be immediately available versus what might be necessary.
Thank you so much, Aman and Easwaran. But I'm also thinking, while we are trying to put all of these levers together, I'm also thinking that are these models and development pathways conscious and sensitive to the kind of, so to say, climate crisis that's panning out in our everyday lives? Every day we hear some sort of the other climate record that we break, and which are unprecedented in that something, let alone our models, but have not been anticipated before. And we are also seeing that we are reaching critical tipping points when it comes to glaciers, when it comes to carbon capture in our wetlands, in other areas as well. What I'm trying to also come at is that are these development pathways, are these models keeping pace with what we are seeing on our outside?
Not well, I think. I want to qualify that I'm not a climate scientist, but I think everything that we're hearing points to the fact that we know as a community that climate change would have these tipping points, these cascading effects, these feedback loops, but we can't begin to anticipate them, because what we're trying to do is understand an entire Earth system, which we haven't been able to do very well. And that's why we're not able to anticipate some of the pace of change that we're seeing. When it comes to models, a couple of which are used for policy making, a couple of their limitations are that they're not necessarily able to think about what the distributive effects might be. For example, you might say that renewables will create X million jobs and phasing out coal will destroy X million jobs. But it doesn't fully account for the fact that the job creation in renewables might be in a very different location than job losses in a second location. That is one. The second is that many of these models are not able to account for the physical impacts of climate. So if you're talking about India reaping co-benefits from climate actions, they don't fully account for the fact that it may also lose billions in damages in lives and livelihoods in those years in which it's projecting its pathways, and that might impact its own ability to realize some of these co-benefits going forward. So, and that's a problem with all models, whether it's 20-year-old models or even the ones that are coming up right now. So there is a need for rethinking how we approach modeling. But there's also a second order question about, to what extent we need to focus on just modeling, and to what extent we need to rely on more traditional indigenous sources of knowledge and recognize that this will happen. The extent might vary, but we need to account for it no matter what, even already.
Yeah, thank you, Aman. I completely agree that models do not account for climate impacts, but we also can't expect every model to account for everything, right? So we use these modeling studies as a starting point to have a discussion on the various pathways for a country to decarbonize, while keeping in mind some of their core development objectives. And this becomes crucial for developing countries and emerging economies like India, where these countries are on an energy demand trajectory, unlike Western countries that have already peaked their emissions, are in a sort of post-peak transition towards a zero carbon world. And with historical contributions to carbon emissions coming into the picture, it becomes quite clear that it's the advanced industrialized countries that have significantly higher emissions per capita population they have needs to go first, not just because of the historical burden that they carry for having put the most amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but also for having the technology and the know-how today to rapidly decarbonize. their economies. And there is this argument globally from developing economies on the idea of a carbon space, right? Like how much space, there is only very limited amount of carbon space in the atmosphere for us to reach this limit where we will start seeing temperature rise that would then cause all of these tipping points, some of which we are already witnessing globally. The LA wildfires, followed by heavy rains and floods, is just one example of how exacerbated every meteorological event is going to be with climate change. A lot of these have happened in the past as well, just that the rate at which it happens and the intensity of these natural disasters are going to be bigger and larger because of climate change. So the idea of carbon space emerging from developing countries is that energy is absolutely necessary for development, and unfortunately all of energy is not decoupled from emissions yet. And given we were not historical contributors to this climate problem, why don't developed countries who were historical contributors, who have the technology and the know-how, and who have peaked their income levels and emission levels already, go first, while providing the much necessary carbon space for developing countries to first grow their incomes, reach a level of prosperity that would make them more resilient to this rapidly changing climate. After which we will also follow and bring down our carbon footprint to zero. So this is the large argument that's been put forth from developing countries, but that's not a point behind which developing countries can hide, right? India will be the largest emitter by mid-century if China and the US are going to significantly reduce their emissions, and India continues its business as usual situation with existing climate policies in place. And what does that mean? We will become the new contributor to this problem. Besides that, we are already witnessing climate disasters at a large scale, and we are one of the most climate vulnerable countries where we are both dependent on monsoons for our agricultural prosperity and rivers from glacial melt in the north that are rapidly disappearing due to climate change. So all of this makes climate action an absolute necessity, but then that has to be balanced with core development objectives of reaching a certain level of prosperity. And the bigger question becomes, can we reach that level of prosperity by simultaneously decoupling energy from emissions? And that's where zero carbon technologies come into picture. One of the technologies that we didn't discuss today is nuclear, which is a form of clean energy. Unfortunately, a technology that has had a negative learning curve, where over time, as the technology matured, the cost of the technology actually increased as we got to know more about issues with safety. But it is one of the clean technologies that can provide significant amount of baseload condition necessary for industrial growth. And as you can imagine, a good part of the world is already thinking about bringing back nuclear and expanding nuclear power capabilities, much more at a smaller scale, what many call a small modular nuclear reactor technology. It's not a fully mature technology yet, but that's also in the discussion that could potentially decouple energy from emissions. So I think India overall has to look at it from this perspective, that we have this absolute need to develop, provide employment for millions of people entering our workforce, increase our income levels and prosperity levels, become more resilient as a society to adapt and manage this rapidly changing climate, while also making sure that we reduce our own impact on causing climate change over time. while simultaneously also pushing the developed world to do more, right? So it's a very complicated game that India has to play in this issue.
Easwaran, that was a perfect call to action, if I were to put it, the summary. So we're running out of time. I wish I could continue learning from all your research and the work that you're doing. But before we wrap up this call, I'm just curious if both of you could highlight one area that holds promise, one work that you're doing which you might want to share with all of us. It could be, you could answer either of them. Something with which basically we could be more hopeful about, and so to say, with which maybe we could ramp up the pace of things the way they are right now. Aman, do you want to take a stab first?
Yet another tough question. You're asking me for where I see cause for optimism. So look, I think it depends on how you look at it, because so if I were to take finance as an example, there's a lot of cause for pessimism. There's also a lot of cause for optimism, and I think it depends on how you look at it. Because on the pessimistic side, what I see is international finance is not flowing, and we've seen that from the disappointing COP outcomes. And that's because developed countries have their own priorities. They're driven by their own domestic politics. This and that and the other. Domestically, our public finance is stretched, and Easwaran alluded to some of this as well. We have a very small tax base with increasing tax exemptions for our income taxpayers. That means even less public money when we have so many of these competing welfare objectives. Domestically, the private sector is still a little bit underdeveloped. Our financial markets are not as mature as the Western financial markets. So all of that comes down to saying that finance flows are, a fraction of what they need to be, and that's a very bleak picture. There is cause for optimism, on the other hand, because we are seeing those finance flows increasing. The government issued green bonds a couple of years ago as a test, and they were subscribed. And they were subscribed largely by the public sector, banks, the life insurance corporation, and so on, because the government was also able to leverage its ownership of these enterprises to get them to invest in green activities, which again comes down to the role of the state in managing those financial flows. We're seeing, there's a lot of green bond, climate taxonomies, and increasing action by the corporate sector. We're seeing huge conglomerates in India kind of integrating their supply chains to be ready for climate action, whether it's going from renewables to green hydrogen to ports and so on. So I think where I see cause for optimism is twofold. While recognizing that the current levels of action are severely inadequate, the causes for optimism are twofold. One is the improving state of knowledge, and we are continually improving that knowledge, whether it's through our modeling studies, whether it's through various streams of work that we're undertaking. The second is that in terms of our actions, sometimes they're a little bit uncoordinated, but we have moved from kind of piecemeal things to trying a little bit of an all of the above approach. And I see that in the finance space, as I mentioned, through green bonds and taxonomies and private action and carbon markets and this and that and the other. Not all of them will work. Not all of them are ideal. But through this approach of kind of trying everything, we're also getting a real life case study of what might work and what might not. And that, I think, is also some cause for optimism.
Easwaran, you?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of challenges, right? So I'll not delve into it now. But having said that, definitely there is reason for optimism, right, in climate policy. One that Aman mentioned is that climate is being mainstreamed into policy thinking gradually, and we are witnessing that with NAPCC and National Solar Mission starting in 2008 and where when climate action was not really a mainstream, policy imperative, right? To now, seeing the introduction of the National Hydrogen Mission, Green Hydrogen Mission, the Critical Minerals Mission, which was just announced in the budget, and the priority given to clean energy manufacturing through the production-linked incentives. However imperfect many of these policies may be, we see that this direction of change in policy thinking, that climate action is absolutely essential while we also try to grow our economy. Many of these imperfections in policy design and implementation have to be addressed, and that's what we work on, and we try our level best to inform policymakers. But I see that policymakers are listening and giving importance to climate as an issue. One challenge is that climate is not a political issue yet. Like how air pollution is not even an issue in deciding politics today, right? So that needs to happen for large-scale systemic change to unfold in the country. The second reason for optimism is the states. There is significant thrust for green industrial policy in various states. Tamil Nadu has established the Green Climate Company, has very ambitious green industrial policies to make a successful transition of its automobile sector from supplying parts and components to traditional automobiles to the electric vehicles. And that's born out of a genuine concern of losing jobs if they didn't make that transition happen, right? So the same thing is happening in Maharashtra. You see that happening in Karnataka, in Gujarat. But the unfortunate situation is that a lot of green industrial policy is happening in states that are already prosperous with a decent level of know-how on how to do manufacturing, how to plug into an export economy, etc. But what we really need to see happen is states that are historically dependent on fossil fuel resources transition and think about green industrial policies. I'll leave it here with both that opportunity being there and currently a challenge that we face.
Thank you so much, Aman and Easwaran. With these strands of hope, I think we can conclude this conversation. Truly, it was enlightening for me to know that there is process work that is happening that tries to bring in different forces that could bring in change, tectonic change are working. Those theories are developing. And hopefully, we see all of these theories in action soon, and we can deal with the climate crisis that's unfolding at the same pace, or even better, what's unfolding outside. So thank you so much for your time, Aman and Easwaran.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Anirudh, for having us.